This is the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. We're joined by the co-founders of Leaft Foods, John and Maury Penno. Their ambition is to create value for eaters and farmers alike and align this with positive environmental outcomes. Tapping into John's experience as co-founder, CEO and chair of Synlait Group, and Maury's background in science and her experience as a senior executive at Frontiera, they are pushing to make change happen. Since launching in August 2019, Leaft Foods has succeeded in securing Series A funding with Coastal Ventures, NBA player Steven Adams, as well as Ngāi Tahu Holdings and ACC's Climate Change Impact Fund. John says it's up to New Zealand business to leap in and make change happen. And he says the smartest young people are looking to work for businesses that make a difference. We begin by asking John and Maury how the Leaft Foods journey began.
Well, as you mentioned in your very well-researched background on both of us, we've come from similar but different backgrounds. So John from real agriculture, farming and science, and I came from engineering, strategy consulting, and then found my way into the dairy industry through that. And so both different pathways, but both of us really passionate about New Zealand, passionate about what we've got to offer the world in terms of our export opportunities, but also both deeply concerned about some of the environmental challenges that we face and the not clear pathways or solutions for how we might tackle that. So we made a decision 6 or 7 years ago that we would work our way out of our executive careers and look for ways to, rather than stand on the sidelines saying things needed to be different, that we would actively contribute. At the time, I think we thought we might become a bit more like you and invest in a portfolio and have it do well and, use our experience to guide and nurture. But that wasn't, I don't think it suited our personalities terribly well. And B, we struggled to find things of the magnitude that we thought were needed. So about 5 years ago, we came across the concept of leaf protein on that journey, and I'll let John pick up from that point.
Yeah, the only thing I'll build on from that is that the world changes through business. Businesses and the way they're built change the world, and it's often new businesses that really move the dial. So new businesses that start, big businesses always start somewhere, and they start from small people being prepared to take ideas and pick them up and build teams and get the capital in behind them and all those things, and that's that's great fun, and it's risky and hair raising as well, but it really does make a difference when you can make it work. And this Leaft concept has the potential to really change the way that food production systems are working. So essentially, what the system is in a nutshell is that we work with farmers who grow leafy crops that they're already very familiar with growing, so we're not asking them to make big changes. And in the leaves of those crops is a protein called Rubisco. It sits in the photosynthetic pathway. It's a white protein, it's tasteless, it's odorless, which sounds a bit boring, but it's also got a fantastic amino acid profile, so nutritionally it's very, very good. As good as animal proteins, and it has a whole lot of functional properties, which also make it very, very good as a food protein.
Have you got a fire alarm?
It feels like we're sitting in New York at the moment. There's about 400 fire engines driving past, but it adds to the effect between the ambience. Yeah, ambience between farm and city.
Yeah, it's nice and calm here. So this Rubisco protein sits in the photosynthetic pathway, and it's the most abundant protein in the world. It's in all green leaves. It was discovered sort of 50 years ago, and various people have tried to figure out how might we extract that and put it into a production system. And I guess what we're doing is saying, number one, there's a big emerging demand for plant proteins in the food production system. We know that they are much lighter footprint in terms of the food production system. Lower carbon footprint, cleaner water, a whole lot of good things in that system. And the technology is caught up and allowing us to start separating out these proteins. And then I guess as the business has developed, as businesses do, we're starting to think more and more about all the other side streams of product that comes from that, and how do we valorize the entire sort of plant as we harvest it, and how do we build a system around that. So early stage, but a growing team of people and really starting to get somewhere.
Do all plants have this protein?
All green leaves have this protein. You've got any pot plants in that room with you, they have Rubisco in them. It's the enzyme of photosynthesis. So it does the work of converting sunshine and CO2 into sugars.
And that's why it's the most abundant protein in the world. So
really the reason it hasn't been extracted before is because it's just the technology hasn't been there to be able to do it. Is that right?
Well, two reasons really. So first reason is there's not historically been a strong demand for plant-based proteins. So there's been over the last 100 or so years, there's been a few pushes in this direction. And the first real big push was during World War II, when it looked like the UK might be blockaded and they might be short of protein. And there was a real effort to extract leaf protein. But they didn't get blockaded and that research didn't go anywhere. And then there was another big push during the 70s oil crisis, which John has quite a good story about how he used to stumble across that plant. So there's that. There's not been strong enough demand for plant protein. And secondly, the technology, when people have tried to get there, they haven't been terribly successful. They've ended up with something sort of very green and not an awesome product.
So how did you get to exploring it as a concept and then thinking about moving it forward? I mean, obviously you've known about it for a while, but taking it to the next step and trying to build something is quite a big decision.
We were looking for things that would move the dial for food production systems in New Zealand. So there was, and we were looking at a range of small companies. There's a whole bunch of startups around New Zealand and some really interesting ones. But we didn't see anything that was fundamentally changing or enabling New Zealand really to participate in the food revolution that we're pretty confident is coming. There's some very big changes coming, we think, in the next few decades to the way that food is produced and consumed around the world. And so we were looking, and Maury dragged me along to a hackathon that was at Lincoln. She was involved in the Lincoln University. They were refreshing their strategy, and one of the activities that they had going, they were running this hackathon. And I'd just stepped away from being CEO at Synlait, or I was in the process of doing it. And last thing I wanted to do on a weekend was go to a hackathon. I didn't even know what a hackathon was, actually. She said, "We're going to a hackathon. We're going to judge."
We're the coaches.
We're the coaches. I said, "What's a hackathon?"
Am I going to coach it?
Yeah. And anyway, we went along and we met. There was a whole bunch of people stood up and presented their ideas in terms of how, I think it was how plant proteins would sort of change the world, or how farming systems might ideas people had for changing things. And there was an old gentleman there called Rod McDonald, and he'd actually been involved in a project at Ruakura that was running in the 70s and 80s, where they were using essentially this technology to reduce the protein concentration of forages, because if you do that, the animals will perform better. Often our forages have too much protein for our cows and animals. And if you can bring it down a bit, one, it's a less wasteful metabolic process, and two, you might be able to harvest some of that protein. So they were working on it way back then, but they didn't have the technology to purify it sufficiently. And Rod's idea was sort of not quite there, but it was a really interesting. It took me back to when I actually started my career at Ruakura for 10 years, and there was this big machine sitting there, this processing plant out the back that had never been disassembled or taken apart, and so I sort of knew vaguely of this process, and so that started us thinking, what if We got the farmers growing their crops. What if we could extract the proteins? We did a whole lot of research. Actually, Maury started extracting some of these proteins on the kitchen bench here in the house. We could get to green protein gels, or Maury could get to green protein gels, which looked quite interesting. Then we did the maths. We went and employed raw. We decided, yep, we'll have a go at this. So we got a really smart young protein and industrial engineer who's now the CEO of the company, Ross Milne, and he sort of bought into it, got help from Callaghan, Canterbury University, and a whole lot of others. And we started just looking at, well, what might the yield be? How much of this could we get per hectare? How might we build the system? How might we run an extraction process? He did enough work with those people to convince himself, I guess, that it was viable. We started building the financial model in terms of how it might all work. And the key thing we found was that really got us excited about it was, number one, even with where we've got the technology to today, we can produce as much high quality protein per hectare as a dairy farm, the average New Zealand dairy farm. But the kicker is that it's such an efficient process because you're extracting it directly from the leaves of plants without any animals in the system. You're doing that from about 5% of the dry matter grown on per hectare of land on an annual basis. And 95% of that feed is available for other things. A lot of it we put back into the farming system in a way that reduces the environmental footprint of that farm. But then there's some other products that we can create value with as well. So, big demand for the protein, highly efficient production system, a way of working with farmers to reduce their environmental footprint sounded like a pretty good basis for a business, and we've gone about building the business from there.
And just to be clear, John did no coaching that day. He sat down.
Have you been to one since?
No, that was enough. Yeah. I have no idea what anyone else said on that particular day. There was a whole bunch of presentations, and some of them were probably quite good ideas, but this one was the really intriguing one. Yeah.
Captured you.
It did, yeah.
I was, I think it was just this morning, I was listening to national radio, and someone from Farming Weekly was on talking about, I think, COP27 and climate change in farming, and he said he gets a bit of grief because, and some farmers call it farming wokely, because he's trying to at least have the conversation about climate change, and he said, it's always a minority of people that are against it. Most people are really productive in their conversations and trying to think about it together. As soon as you've both come from the traditional farming space, I guess, of Synlait and Fonterra could be called the traditional farming space, into something slightly left field, although not in direct competition necessarily, but in some ways it is. What is the reaction from the traditional community around this? Are these sorts of things looked upon as good, or is this a threat that the traditional farming space don't like, or is this something that you think everybody can work in unison to help with our climate change credentials?
Yeah, I guess we're really clear that we're not in the vegans versus carnivores battle. We need more solutions. So obviously the climate crisis is real, and we don't really enter debates on that. We need more solutions, not less solutions. So we're wanting to bring a solution to the table. We want a solution that will work for New Zealand, and a lot of the plant-based options like peas or soy, we would never be competitive on a global scale. We'd never get up to scale, probably wouldn't compete with dairy returns. So I'm not sure what would be achieving at that point. So what we've been looking for is something that enables farmers, who first and foremost are farmers, they're innovative. A lot of the dairy farmers today were not dairy farmers before, but they were farmers. So they're pretty open to change. It's not always the rhetoric, but actually, if you look through history, they're always willing to change. And we wanted a system that could work with that. I don't know that we originally thought would come up with something which was quite as neat and circular as the system that we've come up with is. But the fact of the matter is it's leveraging the strengths that the country already has. We have a climate which grows green leafy crops very well. That's why our dairy industry has been successful. So we're just leveraging those green leafy crops in a different way which, as John said, still provides 95% of that product back into the traditional farming system. So the response we've had has been really positive, curious, interested. And I'm fair to say, we're not really involved in the more negative corners. we've got plenty to do. So we've really enjoyed the people we've been working with and had a really positive response.
I mean, that's often the case with these things, isn't it? That it's a small minority that don't want change, and everybody's out there trying to do. I mean, we don't have the most efficient dairy farming industry in the world for no reason. There's a reason why we have it, I guess, in terms of, and I'm sure you've seen that in the journey at Fonterra for you, Maury, and with Synlait, that there's been heaps of change in that sector, and so it's not all negative.
Change, when you're talking about macro level change like this, it doesn't come about because people have debates and reach new philosophical sort of views, like we need to eat better because of climate change, or we need to eat better or change our farming system because of what we're doing to waterways. Those sort of high-level views, the people change. If they're consumers, they change because the food tastes better, it's better for us, and it's cheaper. That's when you get really big change. And it's the same at a farming level. The farmers will change as soon as there are better options that lower their environmental footprint, but also allow them to, run their businesses well, make plenty of money, look after their people, have a better lifestyle as a business owner, as an operator. And so you've got to get true change that's meaningful, lasts, and happens at scale. You've got to be thinking about those things, and that's what we keep reminding ourselves of at Leaft. We've got to come up with a food we've got to come up with food products and solutions that taste better, are cheaper, and are better for people, and that'll create demand. And for farmers, we've got to come up with options that allow them to make more money while reducing their environmental window. The regulatory change and sort of forced change in these systems, people are very clever. They find ways around it if it's not economically sensible. And so, yes, there's always a few who will change for philosophical reasons, but unless you got those basic economic drivers right, it's very hard to get systems level change. And that's why, if you take the dairy analogy, as Maury was saying before, Canterbury did not used to be a dairying region. It's now the biggest dairying region in New Zealand because it's by far and away the best economic option for farmers in Canterbury. If you've got good soils and irrigation, you'll make more money out of dairy, and it's a reasonably simple system to run. So we've got to come up with a system that's better than that and reasonably simple to run, and the farmers will run to it.
It's Maury, you mentioned at the start around World War II and some of these developments happening then, and I think it wasn't corn with a Q that sort of that I think that was invented in World War II, but for all the reasons, John, you just mentioned that it's still in the supermarket shelves, but only just because it just doesn't taste that good and is really expensive. And I guess that's what you're trying to do the opposite of. It has to taste good or be involved in a process that tastes good and be economical, both to produce it but also to consume it.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess from that first day at Lincoln, the concept was not necessarily one that was looking like it would taste that great, but it was very interesting. As we got into it and got to understand Rubisco and its properties better, we learnt and can now produce a protein which is a light colour, it's great tasting, it's really soluble, it foams, it gels, and it's as well as having a complete amino acid profile. So it just every sort of corner we've turned, it gets more and more remarkable. So it's not a very efficient enzyme, and it's as it turns light to CO2, but as a protein, it's fragile and it's live, and it's got these wonderful properties.
So customers, how would you describe your customer base at this point in time? Have you got to that point, or are you still in this sort of market development phase?
No, it's an interesting. Everyone knows about it, right? When I say everybody, the food techs and the big companies know about it. So it's talked about as the utopia protein. It's the protein that everybody wants to start building these food products out of. And we do talk about plant proteins like it's brand new. Plant proteins aren't new. Soy protein's been part of the food production system for a long, long time. But it's just got well-known limitations. It's got well-known limitations in terms of where it's grown and how it's grown. Last year, there was 1 million hectares of Amazon rainforest that was chopped down to largely grow soy. That's in the last 12 months. So it's got big environmental problems. It's also got functional and flavour constraints as a protein, and it's because it comes from the seed. Our protein comes from the leaf, and so it's a living, as Maury's been explaining, it's got work to do every day, and so when we're harvesting, it's a live protein, which is much more like an animal protein than the traditional plant proteins that we've thought about.
Yeah, which is a seed, which is designed for storage and durability and surviving through intestines and things like that.
So it's when you're trying to redesign a system, it's scalable. And those food production companies have known about these properties because it's been produced at sort of benchtop scale for quite a long time. It's been well studied research. There's a lot of literature about it. And so it's almost as if people are waiting for someone to bring it to market. So when you talk to the big multinationals, they can't wait to start incorporating it into their products. It doesn't need to go. The big market pull is not necessarily, what we traditionally think about as plant-based milks or plant-based meats. It'll go into blended food products quite early. It'll replace existing but inferior sources of protein that are already huge in the market. We see early on, we've got our eye on a particular application for a consumer product, which we think is very close to the product that essentially falls out of our spray dryers when we've made the product. So it'll phase. We do want to start, and this is a bit controversial in New Zealand. Has been quite controversial with New Zealand investors who say it's a bit hard to get a consumer product away. We're quite focused on developing a consumer product in the early years, and partly as a showcase for the protein in terms of what it can do, partly because we think there's just a killer application there that we're focused on that we think will, in a market that's growing very, very quickly. There's far less regulation around this than some of the other food products that New Zealand has traditionally made. So because it's not competing with products that are traditionally made, farmed in Europe and America, we can get access into those markets more readily than we can with our traditional dairy meat, which tend to be tariffed out to protect the local farmers. Because the local farmers don't make this, it's much more free market access. And so we think it'll start. Our plan is to start with a consumer product, and we're doing a lot of. At the same time as we're developing up the process, we're developing up the market opportunity for that. Getting a lot of advice from the sorts of people who have made these things win in the past. But long term, it'll end up being when the process is successful, there's no question that it'll become a large scale commoditized ingredient over time. If you come back in 30 years, it'll probably be the biggest traded plant protein commodity globally over time. Because it's so efficient. It's so much more efficient than protein from seed, so much more efficient than animal production systems. It'll definitely turn up, and the big food manufacturers of the world understand that, and they're watching.
I love that you are looking that far ahead. A lot of, as opposed to the next quarter. So that's. We did a little bit of research in the lead up to this, and over the next 10 or 8 years, not 30 years, the plant-based protein market is going to go from $30 billion US in 2020 up to 160-something billion. So it's at 4.5 times increase in 8 years from now, which is, that's a massive tailwind to if you can
And those plant-based ones at the moment are inefficient, and so to take that market share is sort of not exactly doing good things necessarily.
There's not so much they're inefficient, we're more efficient.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that when people move to a plant-based protein, they're often starting out on that journey because they want to make a difference environmentally or for animal welfare reasons or for values-based reasons. They shift to that protein. So let's say it's in a smoothie, but then the taste isn't that good. It's gritty and sandy, and they get sick of it, and they end up switching back, to the whey type powders. So it's a bit of a backwards and forwards. So we're really clear that to be a big part of that growth, our product needs to win on that taste and texture and solubility, so that you change because you want to, and then you're happy with that change and you stay there.
When you think about, say for instance, for a second that A2 milk and Synlait were the same company, and you had the branded A2 going out to sort of talk about the A2 protein, and then that sort of led to the success of, I guess, just uptake and knowledge about A2. Is that kind of the strategy around, I know they're two separate companies, but then I guess they were sort of both achieving great things together because of the knowledge. But I mean, I knew nothing about A2 protein at all, and both my kids use A2 formula, which is, to convert someone like me, I'm your typical, just do everything that you, what's easiest at the supermarket shelf, and now I'm sort of a stickler for it. Is it the same concept with this, that if you get out to the consumer with the story around what the protein is, and then follow it up with all the other different usages that you can go for, is that because it's all about not brand recognition, that's the wrong word, but sort of protein recognition?
That is one of the things that we're working through at the moment, is the story of Rubisco and what it has to offer is a really deep story with many, many layers. So as we bring a product to market, how do we introduce it? And then how do we work down through those layers? Because there's way more than any one consumer can swallow in one go. We want to create the sticklers. You try it for a simple reason, and then the more you learn, the more you love it, and the more you want to stay with it. So that's the goal that we're working through at the moment.
But there's no question that some of the learnings we've taken from sort of watching how the Synlait A2 relationship has developed over time, they're definitely impacting our current strategy. We have, A2 is a great example of where if you really do have something that is truly differentiated, and you have a really big market opportunity, then actually we can cut through and create consumer brand. A2's done a fantastically successful job of that. Many, many people in New Zealand thought it would never happen. That opportunity was there for the New Zealand Dairy Board and Fonterra. They said, no, that's not going to work. But this new startup company took it. And because they were in the market, they didn't initially think about infant formula, but because they were in the market and then that infant formula opportunity in China presented itself, they were there ready to go. We're taking, some of that same thinking is coming into the way that we're approaching this. We've got this amazing protein. We've got a world who's demanding it. And if, in the same way that 15 years ago, the massive opportunity was the infant formula explosion that was going to happen in China, we're actually sitting on the verge of that in protein. So the world is waking up to the importance of protein nutrition, not for youngsters, but for aging people. Once we're over 40, we've got to increase our protein intake and we've got to bring down our caloric intake. And that means fortification with protein. It means changing the way we eat so that we're getting more healthy proteins. And the aging population around the world are understanding that more and more. And so there's this massive latent demand for these products. So if we can come with a more efficient way of delivering those amino acids, those proteins, in a way that, again, the theme is tastes great, delivers the nutrition at a lower price point that is, than is available.
We talked about that.
But ultimately, that's what's going to move the dial. Now, but you see the same trends there. There are very high price points being paid for pure protein nutrition at the moment. because as this, these people, young people, and increasingly aging people are understanding this. So how might we stand in the market, create a brand to do exactly what you were talking about, James, to build awareness of this product, and particularly in the early years when just it's natural, the business won't be producing hundreds of thousands of tons in the first instance. We'll be producing a small amount, but then there's a real possibility we think that we'll be able to grow a consumer brand at the same rate as we're growing the manufacturing base for producing the product in the early years, and then at the same time be developing and working with B2B opportunities, which we're already in discussions with, people who make alternative meats, people who make alternative milks, thinking about what they need. And we'll, longer term, that will definitely be, that it'll be delivered through lots and lots of players. Just like A2 still hold a dominant position, but I think now there's 60-odd brands of A2 formula in the China market, most of which don't come from the A2 milk company, because it's become the standard. It's become how it works.
The A2 milk is almost, it's like sellotape, you sort of almost, it's the brand is turned into the product in a way, and which is great in a sense, but it's a competitive market out there now. But first mover advantage, I guess, gets you there.
The difference with this is, though, that while in time there is no doubt we won't be the only manufacturers of Rubisco, we're increasingly confident that we've got a big head start in our production system. And through a combination of sort of managing the IP around by keeping it quiet in terms of exactly what you're doing. And even at the start of this call, Maury just typed it. I was starting to talk about a few things I'm not supposed to talk about. She actually sent me a WhatsApp.
The legal background jumps in.
Hey, don't forget, we're not allowed to talk about this stuff. Through that and actually an IP strategy that we're developing, we want to carve out quite a few years, potentially decades of time when we can be scaling our manufacturing processes while others can't. And there are some natural advantages that New Zealand has here. So most agricultural nations around the world are much more seasonal than we are. Our agricultural systems, dairy, beef, sheep, they're based on the idea that you can actually grow leafy crops and graze animals outdoors 12 months of the year. And the reason we can do that is that we're in the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot, not too cold, and our leafy crops, grass, grows all year round. And so that lends itself beautifully to a manufacturing process, because you can build a factory, you can keep it full all year round. Most of the areas around the world that grow the crops that we're working with have very seasonal production systems. They might be able to grow them for 6 months, but for 6 months it's too cold. And so that gives us a big head start. It's something that's really well suited here to New Zealand. It'll go to the rest. It'll go out to other nations and other places around the world over time. But it gives, this is something that really New Zealand could excel at.
What is the crop that you're? Is it predominantly grass, or is there a tree or a plant that gives you a better?
He's trying to get in there.
and I'm not asking for IP. It's fascinating. I mean, there's so many. My head's spinning, but I just think of sometimes I use personal circumstances too much to say that an idea is great and I'm the only one. But the amount of people that are sort of moving to it, not necessarily a vegetarian diet, but at least cutting huge amounts of meat protein out of their diets for health or whatever reasons. And then you've got things like what's happening in Ukraine at the moment and what that's done to the corn and wheat market, and the fact that exactly what you're saying, John, they're so reliant on one crop in one part of the year that and look what it can do to food production and prices and the food shortage in other countries who are net importers. I mean, this is game changer if you can grow these sorts of proteins round the clock and in an efficient way and then the changes in markets. But it's but I guess is it just your good old grass that does it?
Well, Rubisco's in every green leaf that there is, and leafy green forage crops are particularly productive. We have looked at like 12 to 15 crops and studied them, and they've all demonstrated that they've got potential. At the moment, we've been doing a lot of our work around lucerne or alfalfa, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's a lot of research on lucerne. It's a very well-known crop, so it's really well understood, which helps us. We're working in a world where we're trying to do a
Is
lot.
lucerne and alfalfa, is it the same?
Lucerne and alfalfa are the same thing.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're the same thing. So it's very well researched, very well understood. We grow plenty of it. The other thing is it's nitrogen fixing, so you're putting less urea on the land, which obviously from an environmental perspective is a gain. It's got very deep tap roots and it's perennial, so you're not cultivating a soil each year, so that also has environmental gain. And I think although the science behind soil sequestration is behind where we'd like it to be, sort of can hopefully anticipate that as that science catches up, it will show that deeper rooted crops, which are putting the sugars deeper into the ground, probably sequester more carbon than more shallow rooted crops. So, and in addition to that, it's a high protein, highly productive, very high growth crop. But there are plenty of other crops as well, which for different reasons, whether it's because they're more winter active or whether they soak up excess nitrogen, whether they fit into a farming cycle better or whether there's consumer demand, that over time we'll be able to, we've got a prioritised list and we'll work our way through that. We're just trying to limit the number of variables at the moment when we've got very many variables without even trying.
Different flavours depending on the crop. I'll stop asking for the IP, but
well, luckily the flavours will be coming from the things that we add later.
Yes.
I was just thinking about how the usages, and obviously there's meats, and which requires quite a lot of skill in producing an alternative. But rattling off the top of my head, there's a whole bunch of things. Obviously, there's protein powders. You see protein-reinforced muesli bars, milks, yogurts, all of those things, which everyone seems to be more and more a part of your diet. And I imagine that this protein would be, that probably could be one of the areas you're looking at. But it's much more common than I initially thought about.
But I also think that the world is thinking in a less binary way about plant proteins versus animal proteins now. So there's through another part of my life, ongoing part of my life, I was out with a big customer last night with Sunday actually, and we were talking about this. And the world pretty clearly going to go to 10 billion population, but with a different age profile. Less babies, aging population, people living longer. And at the same time, growing recognition that just like we talk about here, the environmental constraints are going to hold back animal production systems. So you've got this burgeoning population who wants a higher quality diet, but we're probably not going to see big increases in animal production globally. It might stay about the same, might button off a bit like we see here. So how are we going to put enough protein into the mouths of the big population? You're going to see more blended foods come forward. There'll be lots of foods come forward that are traditionally solely based on animal proteins that start seeing fortification with plant proteins, so that you've still got great taste, great flavour, functionality that comes with animal, but you've got some of the other attributes that come from plant, including just the fact that they're more productive and therefore there's more of it available. So I think that we'll go through a phase of food production systems will go through a phase of transition. Milk, yes, there will still be oat milks and all of these specific plant-based products, solely plant-based, and some consumers will take that and run with it. But I think the big middle will find that just like we've done for years with sausages, for example, you're going to see blended products come forward more and more. We're not going to notice a taste difference. We're not going to notice a functionality difference, and we're not going to bother reading the back of the pack. Actually, it's happening already. You start picking up packs and seeing the number of products that have soy proteins through them or other sources of animal proteins being blended together in mixtures and manufactured into consumer products that we're all very used to using. That's going to happen more and more and more. And so we'll wake up in 100 years' time and there'll be very little animal products. The plant products and products from other sorts of production systems that are more efficient will have learnt to provide flavours, functionality, price points that can't be achieved with our animal production systems that have evolved over thousands of years. If you go to, if we've got to know some of the other players in this space, Impossible Foods in the United States, they talk about that they think that we're sort of at the same stage as the automobile industry was in the 1920s. Up until the 1920s, we all rode around on horses, most of us. Some of the rich people got cars, and they were a bit of a novelty, but they were dirty, they were unreliable, they were slow. You certainly didn't go on a big journey with one because it was probably going to break down and the roads weren't good enough. Whereas about that time, through the 1920s, suddenly the technology got better, it got cheaper, and suddenly it was more convenient and cheaper to own a car than a horse, and the world changed overnight. We went over a 20 or 30-year period. Automobiles, the technology got good enough that it just replaced the horse. And some stage in the next 30, 40 years, that could well happen with animal production systems. So for us, we need to get New Zealand ready for that. Imagine if that happened when New Zealand wasn't ready and we didn't have farming systems available to us when that food revolution really started clicking in. And our farmers were left high and dry. We must come up with options that enable our farmers to participate in the food revolution that's coming, and that's really what drives us along.
Yeah, we need diversity. So in uncertain times, you need a diverse portfolio.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And we've gone from a nation of we're slowly going from a nation of just exporting one product, which is milk powder and some frozen meat, to a lot more diversity in how we do it. But what kind of support are you getting from the likes of government? And on one hand, I sort of get a little bit tired of thinking it's up to government to do this. We're a country full of smart people. Let's just get on do it ourselves. Which you're exactly doing that. But is there a wider policy, I guess, to help drive these sorts of innovations? Are you well supported?
Yeah, I think from the day that Ross came on board as our CEO, we've been able to work with Callaghan. They've been very supportive and generous. All the major universities have worked alongside us and been fantastic and generous. And then we've had the Ministry for Primary Industries have a fund called the Sustainable Food and Fibre Fund, which we have a program under a $20 million R&D fund under that, which the MPI has provided $8 million. So between those, Crown Research Institutes, universities, and just we've had a sort of general feeling that we've stumbled across all these incredibly talented people who have been doing relevant research that can be applied directly to this, who it sort of feels like they've been waiting for this moment to bring these things forward. So we've felt both from a talent perspective and from an infrastructural support perspective that we've really felt like part of a team. It's been a great journey with many people coming along with us, not just those people we're employing.
It's almost like the fact that you've come from the dairy industry has made it easier to, because the history of food production, not just the technology, but some of these people, in order to get people on the journey, I guess you need the knowledge of where we've come from, perhaps.
We're not 28-year-old crypto entrepreneurs.
Yeah, thanks. Couldn't put it better myself. Exactly right.
Yeah. Oh, that is going back to where we started. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to pull our experience out of all the things that we'd done over all those years and put it to use on something that was really going to move the dial. So it is. We've got a fantastic team of very smart young people. There's a very high and that's the other thing that's happening at the moment is that there's this massive move of talent away from businesses that are just interested in making money to businesses that are interested in making a difference. And so we've been able to attract, great PhDs, brought some people in from actually some of those companies that helped us early on, some of the really smart people have jumped the fence to help us manage IP. They're now working for us rather than in the institutions they were with. But there's people who've come back from overseas. There's people, there's a whole raft of young, very talented young people. But what Maury and I can bring to it is, a lifetime's experience of, building contacts with the food production system globally. And we've seen what works and what doesn't at a high level. So, we sort of know, when we're thinking about strategy, we're pretty quick to call out things that might be just a bit of hope rather than real. So we're trying to bring those things together. The other place that we're getting a lot of support from is the food production system globally. People understand in the food production system, people understand these changes are coming, and so they're very supportive. We went through an A series capital raise, as you do with these things to keep them funded. That the government support was fantastic, but we always knew we were going to need a big chunk of funding to keep the talent coming in while we developed the business. And what was interesting in that process was that there was sort of a lineup of strategic investors, if you like, people who were very, very interested in getting hold of this technology to fuel their own food businesses into the future. But equally, there were the VC financial investing type firms who were interested in, who could see the future. They often had made investments in this space before and sort of knew the strengths and weaknesses. So we were able to choose, we work with Costler Ventures. They came through as sort of the heart of the system. We made room for ACC, their climate impact fund, for Ngaitahu local investors, and then a very small number of private investors in that A series. But the interesting thing was that the strategics were there lining up and potentially could have offered better value, but just a bit restrictive for us early on. So the support is definitely there from a New Zealand end. We're seeing a lot of New Zealand's food companies interested in helping. They can see where this is going. But the investment community globally is seeing, this huge opportunity that's coming with a change in the food production systems and are prepared to invest, perhaps in ways that the tech industries, that the IT industries were seeing, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's, yeah.
If you're getting strategic investors from industry, and I'm assuming the subtext is some of them are probably potential customers, and they own, a portion of it, they might influence who you can sell to into the future as well.
Yeah, that's why we said no to them.
Yeah, I thought there might be.
We thought really hard about the kind of support that we needed and the kind of relationships that we wanted within our ownership profile over the next few years. And I won't say it was easy or quick, but we did find our way to a team of shareholders who we are absolutely thrilled to be aligned with. So I think John and I do have lots of years under our belt, and that doesn't mean that we've got all the experience that's needed here, but we've been pretty useful at finding our way to the people with the experience that we need for any particular given topic on the day.
Just listening to you, one of the things that stands out to me in the way you think about it is obviously the two of you bring, what were your words, understanding from your experience of not just hope but what's real, and that's something you bring to the team. And then on the other hand, you noted that point about A2 and how they started off as milk and then they identified, by chance really, the opportunity in China and completely pivoted the business model. So it feels to me you're sort of bridging that data-driven decisioning and strategy versus bringing experience and a kind of, this is where we're going.
I'd just like to clarify that John always, no matter who he's around, he makes sure everybody shoots like miles high. So just when you thought you had enough ambition and you were going far enough, John pops into every meeting and suddenly you're going a whole lot further and a whole lot
bigger.
So I think we've brought different things and different days, different things come out.
Yeah, but I think both things are true when you said that A2 found their way to the opportunity. You never really know how things are going to develop until you engage, until you're in business and you see who turns up, who's prepared to pay the most, what opportunities work and which don't. But what experience can bring is making sure you're on the right field. You don't want to turn up to the wrong game park, because then you will miss the opportunities. You want to be in the right space, and those fundamentals of, do you have a business model that's going to deliver, the sorts of returns you need, and can you make this truly scalable? Moments like this, when interest rates suddenly go up, risk is being managed in a different way than it was when money was essentially very cheap. Over the last decade, you need to be in a business that can see its way to a profitable model. The idea of developing up technologies when, there's a cool idea and we'll figure out how to make money out of it later, that's much harder for investors to get their heads around. You need to be able to demonstrate to ourselves as much as anyone that, hey, what do we need to believe for this to become profitable? What do we need to believe for this to become scalable? And then let's focus on those points along the journey that we need to solve, and make sure we're confident that we'll get solves for those things.
I think one of the other things I think is one of the best advantages of having a clear strategy is that you've got a clear strategy, you know what you need to do to deliver it, and the environment changes. It's a lot easier to change when you knew what you were doing and how you were doing it than when you were just shooting along.
You're counterfactual, and so you can make a decision from it.
So you can pivot more easily. So if you suddenly figure out that you're on the wrong playing field, you can pick up your bags and get to the correct playing field a lot faster than if you're not looking around, than if you're not understanding, you're just blindly, playing on your own.
On our podcast, we've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, and one of the thematics is a lot of them end up moving to the US, and that's not just for a funding decision. It's perhaps a little bit critical of the aspiration in New Zealand and that real drive to be successful, and perhaps it's not lack of talent, but it's lack of, like you're saying, what John does, aspiration, then take it even higher. Do you think the culture in New Zealand is right for these type, for business? I mean, you've both been successful in it, and so the ecosystem that is New Zealand in terms of starting and working in business has been good to you. But you've obviously also probably observed the climate in New Zealand around growing companies. Do you think things need to change, or do you think we're on the right track? This is New Zealand Inc., not just your business, but.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think we decided that change is up to us. So there's no point saying New Zealand's not good enough, New Zealand needs to be different. Why aren't farmers changing? It's up to us, and we have to leap in and do it. And I think the other advantage of our age is that we have accumulated those networks and ability to make things happen. And if you are young and starting out, man, that's a big, big job. And some environments like Silicon Valley or Israel or other places might make that environment, I think, more easier for younger entrepreneurs to start out. But I feel like with what we're doing at Leaft, there's a whole lot of other companies with young entrepreneurs who are also doing exciting things. So I think it's pretty rapidly improving. So I think we should back it. We should take that momentum and run with it, and assume we can do this. It's up to us.
Yeah, the other thing that's happened recently is the world's got a lot smaller. 3 years ago, the idea of raising capital without meeting people was unheard of.
Yeah.
We were heading into our A series halfway through the pandemic. We didn't know when it was going to end, so we just got on with it. And we actually ran our whole A series and completed it before ever meeting any of the people we were talking to. That was, I think it worked to our advantage, because the best valuations and the best funders were all sitting, they might have been sitting in Hong Kong or Singapore or Silicon Valley. Now, the people who could, if you're trying to engage with a big Singaporean VC fund, and you were in Singapore, you've got a massive advantage because you can pop down the road, you can badger them, you can get them excited, have coffees, do all those things. And same in Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, there's one road with all the VCs. It's right next to Stanford University, and they're there for a reason, so that they can be part of the network. They're hearing about things early. They're meeting people. They're getting to know them. In our process, we were on a level playing field with those parties because we were all on Zoom. Whether they were next door to the VC fund in Silicon Valley or whether they were in New Zealand, we were all on the same page. Those funds were having to continue to invest, having to find parties, and at the same time, we were learning to reach out and engage with people as we are today using technology. The local people were as well. So I think the world has got smaller. Some of this thing we've always talked about is the tyranny of distance here in New Zealand. I think that doesn't have to be anymore. And so, I can see that there are some companies that are better to up sticks and move. But for us, with this technology, we think we're better here than anywhere else.
We will have offshore teams, and it won't be that far away. But we're a New Zealand company.
That's a really positive assessment of two entrepreneurs going out with high aspiration, because it's great that it's sort of starting to be a place where these businesses can launch and thrive and not have to think about that. And growing overseas is a positive thing, getting people rather than moving overseas because you don't have the infrastructure or whatever it is here to support it.
There could be an element of our time has come here, for New Zealand, because we, over the years through the Tohono movement, actually, we've got to know some of the Stanford people really well. And the big clubs in Stanford, when you talk to those guys, the big clubs in Stanford 10 years ago was all about IT. So it was, the best and brightest would turn up. They would think about how they were going to build a business, and they were thinking about how to build a business to sell to Google or to in that space. The big clubs now are in biotech, food production systems, all of those sorts of things. And the entrepreneurs are turning up and thinking about how to revolutionize the food system. And it's because you've got some early stage, highly successful companies sitting around that ecosystem. Stanford, I go back to the Impossible Foods example. A Stanford professor had an idea that if you could take animals out of the food production chain, that would have a massive impact on climate change. And where do you start? You start with burgers. And so, Impossible went from an idea to a $10 billion market cap startup in a 10-year period on the door. And it was part of the Stanford ecosystem, just like Intel was 25 years earlier. And so the best and brightest watch that. And New Zealand, our R&D system, our universities, our CRIs are all focused. We talk about agriculture, but ultimately they're all focused in biotech. And so we think there's, in food tech, biotech, animal production systems, there's a big opportunity for people to get involved and find their ways through to new and exciting ways that are going to make a difference.
And it's up to us. I love that. Circling back around onto that point, I think in the end, when you are at a distance, you can sort of throw your hands up in the air and say, it's all too hard, but I think the other way around is to embrace it and use the technologies we've got to get closer to the epicenter of, if that is Stanford, like so many things seem to be, then, we should embrace it fully and get on with it. Conscious, John and Maury, you've got a business to run and a morning to get to. Thank you both so much for your time. It's been, from my side, an absolutely, really exciting story to hear about. And I wish you all the best for the next phase of scaling up and taking this awesome opportunity to market.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
This has been The Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds KiwiSaver scheme. The the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, the NZ Funds Advised Portfolio Service, the NZ Funds Wealth Builder, and NZ Funds Income Generator. A product disclosure statement for each is available at nzfunds.co.nz. Past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future returns.